Welcome to the Living Your Legacy podcast.
I'm Kim Rain, a life coach and health mentor with over 13 years experience helping people lower their stress and anxiety, lose weight, sleep better and live happier, healthier, more purposeful lives.
I'm Helen Ranson. I've worked for 20 years as a self-employed psychotherapist and coach, helping clients of all ages and backgrounds who've experienced emotional issues, phobias and personal traumas.
The Living Your Legacy podcast is a quest to create amazing life stories, hang out in the moment and live a life full of joy.
Living Your Legacy is a podcast for anyone who wants to get off the sidelines and create the legacy they want to leave behind today. Welcome to this episode of the Living Your Legacy podcast. Today, our focus is on the subject of conversations around dying and care at end of life. I'm speaking to Jill Cox, author of Moments of Meaning, about her personal journey of care and support of close family members and clients at end of life. She has worked in community volunteering in Cheshire with local hospices and with the End of Life Partnership, supporting carers, families and patients in life-limited scenarios. Where would you like to start?
Well, about 11 years ago, I found out that my dad was poorly. He started to deteriorate quite rapidly, and Mum and I weren't sure what was going on with Dad. We found out that he had vascular dementia and he had little bleeds on his brain, which meant that his health deteriorated quite quickly. So I supported Mum in trying to find care for him, the right medical interventions and help. Unfortunately, none of it worked, and we were told that he was coming towards the end of his life, and I supported Mum through that process as he died. And then about 2 years later, my father-in-law was diagnosed with terminal cancer. He'd had cancer 2 years previously, and then he found out he had cancer again. He was again given a terminal diagnosis, and he died in a local hospice. And then 2 years after that, my mother-in-law was diagnosed with cancer. She had chemotherapy. Unfortunately, that didn't work. And with my mum-in-law, my husband, myself and a family friend looked after her at home and cared for her in her own home until she died. And I and the family friend were with her as she took her last breath. All those three experiences were quite meaningful, very stressful at the time, but also I learned an awful lot going through that process. And I think I was the age of 44 when I first was with somebody who died, and that was a shock to my system. And I think that's why I wrote the book, because there's so many of us who come across this for the first time in middle age and really wonder what the hell to do with it.
I know it's something that you and I, as we go on our walks, we chat about quite a lot, because I've had similar sort of experiences running through the last 6 years of my life, losing friends and family, and coming to terms with that grief, as you say, when it's first hits you in middle age is really, really difficult, isn't it? It's really such an unknown quantity that we can never be prepared for.
Yeah, and you just feel so unskilled when you're trying to help and you're trying to navigate through healthcare, social care, trying to keep as normal a life going as possible for the individual, trying to give meaning and purpose, and at the same time feeling like you're floundering and drowning.
Yeah, and having to put your own grieving, if you like, on one side, as as I certainly found, because my dad again had vascular dementia, and you go through many grieving processes, don't you, with somebody with that sort of ongoing condition.
Yeah, because they're losing part of their personality, and you can see that process in front of your eyes, and there's nothing you can do about it. And like you say, you're grieving through that process, but then there is still a massive grief process once they die. So even though you've been processing things as they're coming towards the end of their life, it is still a shock when they die.
And you and I at the time were involved with an organisation locally, weren't we? Involved in volunteering out into the community, giving care, weren't we, to people who, in a sort of outreach service. I know I was counselling and working with people who had anxiety issues. What were you doing out for Ashworth?
Ashworth Time Bank, I worked with them to set up a volunteer programme So we have several volunteers working in the community with people with life-limiting illness. And I would go along and meet the person and their relative and find out what sort of situation they were in, what difficulties they had, what help and support they'd like. And then I'd try and match a volunteer with each individual. And it could be somebody going and sitting and chatting for a couple of hours a week. It could be somebody giving the relative a break so that they could go and do some shopping or get their hair cut. But it could be taking the individual out, accessing countryside or shopping, anything that would give meaning and purpose to their life and keep them going and enjoying life to a certain degree, despite their illness and what was happening to them.
There's no provision, is there, for anything out like that out there? And
it's very difficult, and unless people can afford to pay for it themselves, volunteers are the obvious way to go. And I have to say that I still volunteer, even though I'm not coordinating a service like this anymore. I still volunteer because as a volunteer, you get meaning and purpose as well. You meet with that person, you get to know them as an individual, you get to know their relatives, and you provide something which is very special. And it becomes special to you and special to the individual. And I've got so many happy memories. I've volunteered with 10 people over the last 10 years, and it's become a very important part of my life. 7 of them have died. 1 I still volunteer for, and I'm regularly in touch with her every week. We go shopping together. And she's a friend. And I do enjoy it. We catch up with each other's news, enjoy shopping together. And because I've got a car and my strength, I help her get the shopping and then unpack it at her home. And we sit and have a brew together and chat. It's very pleasant.
At the same time, is that when you started working for the hospice as well, the end-of-life partnership?
Yeah, with the hospice, we linked in the befriending because they were already doing befriending in another area. I did a project for them to look at Crewe and Nantwich to develop their Alsager volunteer befriending scheme. And then I took on the Winsford and Northwich area, and we did volunteering across Winsford, Northwich, and then with Ashford Town Bank, the sort of rural Cheshire area, West Cheshire area. Yeah, and then I became involved with the End-of-Life Partnership in Cheshire as a trustee for the first 3 years. It was a real privilege to see the organisation come together and grow and do some really valuable work with professionals across the whole of Cheshire, helping them as individuals.
So were they trying to pull together end-of-life organisations into some sort of coherent form? What was the objective of what they were trying to achieve?
It was really trying to improve end-of-life care in whatever format was appropriate. So it could be working with GPs and nurses in terms of helping them develop their end-of-life caring skills, in terms of communicating, specialist nursing care, so helping people with breathing difficulties or end-of-life care drugs that help somebody and ease their pain and breathlessness and nausea and anxiety. But it was also working in the community, and they're still doing a lot in the community around trying to get the general members of the general public to come to terms with the fact that we're all going to die, talk about it and make plans and arrangements for it. So it's not just down to the professionals, it's down to all of us to take care of our own needs by planning and preparing, but also being a good neighbour. And if there's somebody in the street who's having a difficult time because of a life-limiting illness, that we get involved and we help and support in whatever way is appropriate for us.
Which is something we seem to have lost.
We do.
That sense of community seems to have, I don't know, disappeared. We don't have the village set up anymore, do we, with the local church being the hub or the pub or village shop or whatever. People seem to be very scattered.
They can be, but I think what we found with the End-of-Life Partnership public health team was that these things were going on in small pockets. I mean, there are lots of churches out there doing pastoral visiting work, but again, with churches, very often their populations are ageing, and the more people age, very often the more help they need and support they need. So we were finding that perhaps older members of the public in these churches were helping those that were with life-limiting illness, and you're wondering where the younger generations are coming through and who's going to help those people that are helping now. But what we're trying to do is I'm still an ambassador for the End-of-Life Partnership, and it's about having conversations whenever and wherever appropriate. So you might be sat next to somebody on a bus, you might be having a conversation with somebody down the local pub, very often with friends, they'll ask about the work I'm doing, and we'll end up talking about powers of attorney or advanced decisions, and they're probably all fed up with me talking about these things. But I do find that it's so important. And recently my husband had cancer. He was diagnosed with tongue cancer. And so we went personally through the process of putting power of attorney and advanced decisions together. And the way I did it was not just to focus on him and say, well, you've got this illness, we need to look at you. What made more sense was for both of us to do it. So he's my power of attorney for health and wellbeing and for finance. And likewise, I'm his power of attorney for both of those. And I also wanted him to write down and be very clear about what his wishes were if he couldn't communicate anymore.
It's this whole taboo subject of dying, isn't it, that nobody wants to talk about. And we leave it and leave it and leave it to the last minute. And it's not until you work within an organisation like a hospice or end-of-life partnership that you actually see in action how much better it makes people's dying process. To bring the subject out into the open and to actually start talking rather than ignoring the fact we are all going to die.
I mean, I'll give you an example. My dad just wouldn't talk. So my mum asked him several times and he wouldn't talk about what his funeral wishes were. So she had to guess. And that was hard for her because there were different views in the family. And at the end of the day, she had to make a decision and a choice. Now, had my dad put down his wishes or even told her what his wishes were, that would have made the process so much easier for her.
And I think in a sort of emotional way, it carries the person on beyond the point of dying, doesn't it? If they've made wishes and you can carry them out, it's almost like they're still in the room.
Yeah.
You know, it makes the ending less sudden somehow. That's the sort of feeling I have. I mean, with my dad, you know, again, he made no arrangements and we had a good idea what we would do for him and what felt right, but he just didn't want fuss and left it at that. And you know,
my dad was exactly the same. No fuss.
Absolutely. And you know, that's all well and good, but you are left to sort of design something. And when you're in that grieving place, that's really hard to do, to be creative and to make that funeral a good experience for everybody who goes, isn't it? It sort of puts a sense of responsibility back on your shoulders again, just at a time when you really don't need it.
And I think it is hard because you're then having to take the responsibility. And if things don't necessarily go to plan, I know with my mother-in-law's funeral, we did our best, but the person who delivered the funeral got her name wrong. And that was so cringy when you're sitting there listening, this woman who was such a formidable woman, and hearing her name said wrong in the service was just excruciating. Whereas we have a mutual friend, she planned her funeral and we both were at that funeral and it was so much more meaningful, personalised. We both spoke
she was
at
there,
it.
Wasn't she?
She was.
She was definitely there and present, which I think made it easier for everybody else. It was actually quite a lovely experience, her funeral.
It was. And we both have very happy memories of her. And I can remember the place where she was buried. I can remember going and visiting that place with her on a rainy day.
Yes, she did. She picked her plot.
She did. She did. But we made it a laugh. And the guy who runs this particular place, he was showing us photographs of different ceremonies. And she was saying, oh, I wouldn't like that. Oh, that looks like a good idea. So she was forming her ideas as we were stood there. And he was a real character.
Very unusual.
He is.
Very unusual for anybody to be actively involved. I mean, even, you know, as I talk to clients who are end of life, unusual still for people to have a will.
Oh, yeah.
Which you know, is really quite amazing that people seem to feel, well, you know, I've not got a lot left to leave, you know, I don't have much, but really missing the point of what will happen after they die and the fractured family they will leave behind. And
it's awful with those sorts of situations because I think our emotions take over and you think it's money and property at the end of the day, but it isn't. It equates to how much you felt loved by that individual who's died. And people very often, there's very much an emotional focus. And where things aren't clear, there can be so much hurt and anxiety. Whereas if it's clear, in the will and the person's communicated what they wish to happen to those relatives before they die, it might bring up some awkward questions, but it gives them time to at least try and resolve those questions. Whereas after they've gone, there is no recall, and the person or the people who are enacting their wishes or trying to sort out the mess very often come under fire at the time when they least expect or need it.
And it can be so difficult for families. There's so many family rifts at that point, aren't there? That's things bubble to the surface that have been brewing for years, and you know, it's really inappropriate for it to happen at that point in time. But unfortunately, with heightened emotions, that's when it all becomes very difficult.
Yeah. But I suppose one aspect of this that really hits me is that when somebody is caring for their loved one as they're coming towards end of life, it's very difficult, as we were talking about conversationally a while ago, it's very difficult for them to care for themselves. And they need to, because they're in it very often for the long haul. Most people who are caring can be caring for weeks, months, years. And if you don't manage as a carer to look after yourself, you can go under and end up not being able to do what you would hope to do for your loved one. Things can happen like they end up being admitted to hospital or into a care home just because there is no one there at home to care for them. So caring for yourself as a carer is as important as caring for your loved one. And anything that you can do to take time out and get support yourself is really important. It's one of the things I cover in the book. Because if you are the sort of person who cares, very often you put everybody else's needs before your own. And then you end up tired, exhausted, not doing the best you can for them. I know certainly I've been in situations where I've not had much sleep, and I can get quite ratty when I don't get much sleep. You and I have talked about this, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think if you can take regular breaks and get support, and it doesn't necessarily mean that other people take over from what you're doing in the fullness of it, but if you can get a couple of hours where somebody's there sitting with your relative and you can take a break and you can have a sleep or go for a swim or have a walk, go and do the shopping, and if you can do that on a regular basis, you're reminded of who you are rather than just being a carer. You are an individual who has thoughts, needs.
In some of the earlier episodes of the podcast, we've talked about living in the moment and focusing on your daily needs in order to stay in the moment and to stay present. And I think caring is one of those instances when you can just completely lose focus on yourself, can't you? And needing to slot those peaceful times, those peaceful moments or mindful spaces into your day when your focus is back on you is really hard as a carer.
Every morning you wake up, you haven't a clue what's going to happen. And with my husband, while he was going through cancer treatment, we got to the stage where we focused on one thing a day to try and improve how he was feeling. He was undergoing chemo and radiotherapy at the same time. And some days he felt so dreadful that there was too much to deal with. So we just focused on one thing. So what was the most pressing thing that would help him that day? And if we solved that, we'd done well. And he was always grateful that one thing was off the list and had been resolved. But
what sort of issues was he facing? What sort of daily challenges did you have?
He had all sorts of health complications. His appetite was rock bottom. One of the things we did each day, I would ask him what he felt like eating. Some things were dreadful. He couldn't taste them, or they tasted really horrible. So each day I'd ask him what he fancied eating, just to try and tempt him, because he was told he had to eat to keep up his strength and his energy and his weight. Otherwise, the long-term consequences for his recovery would be quite dire. So finding things to tempt him to eat was always on our mind. He had lots of other side effects as well. He was constantly sick at the beginning of the treatment, and trying to find some sort of medication that helped him with his sickness was a priority at one stage. His digestion was affected, so getting some help with his digestion was also important. So we just had to focus each day. And there was one weekend that it got too much, and I just had to go out and have a walk. But it's surprising, I went and sat by a fire in a cafe, had a bowl of soup on my own, and then went for a half an hour walk. And by the time I'd just taken that time out and gone back, I I felt so much better.
Mm-hmm.
So it's knowing as a carer when you need to take time out. And that's not always easy, because if you can't leave the individual that you're caring for, then you need to plan in somebody to be there so you can take that time out.
Or have distractions around you so that you can just remove yourself from the moment and step into a different space.
Yeah. I mean, I used to have regular baths.
Yeah.
I was still in the house, I was still available, but having a regular bath.
Yeah, well, it's a nurturing space, isn't it, that you can take yourself into to become present again.
Yeah, and just to remind you who you are. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about the book, because the book's amazing. It's out there on Amazon, so go and have a look. It's divided into chapters, which makes for real easy reading. And it's obviously written from the heart. And it's got such a wealth of simple, basic, common sense driven knowledge in there that anybody can absorb, but the real fundamentals of how to support somebody as they die, really, or as they're living towards the end of life. Everything from conversations to care.
Yeah, I think going through the process several times in quite a short space of time, I almost wanted a friend by my side who had gone through it. You get quite a lot of support from others around you. And some people who haven't been through it try and give you meaningful suggestions without necessarily having been there themselves. Every process is different, so it is very hard to give advice. I found that medical people that we're in conversations with were very helpful, and they had all this knowledge. But I always noticed that they were hurried, they were stretched, and I wanted to sit down and have an hour with one of them and just try and suck all this information out of their brain. But of course, they've got other patients to see, other relatives to see. So you're always getting sort of 10-minute sound bites, and you never feel like you quite get enough time to answer all the questions that you've got.
Or even to be heard as well.
Yeah, it is, because you're always focusing on one or two particular things that you desperately need to sort, and then you're gone, you're out, and the next person's in. I wanted a friend who could basically hold my hand all the way through and said, did you know about such and such a thing? Have you heard about such and such a thing? That's what the book's designed to do. It's not the be-all and end-all, and there's loads of things it doesn't cover, but it's what I found was most helpful, and I wish I'd known when I was going through my first 3 experiences with relatives. I mean, it does help to write things down. It does help to have conversations with your loved ones, to know what their wishes are, so that you can communicate those to other people when they can no longer communicate for themselves. And if it's written down, it just gives you that much more kudos, and people will listen if it's written in their own hand or if it's written in their own words. And you're almost just a spokesperson for them. Whereas if you're saying it as a relative, that's different. It's not quite got the strength and the feeling with it. So the book is really aimed at somebody to be able to pick up, read relatively quickly. A friend of mine picked it up and read it in an afternoon. But then to go back when you remember something and you think, oh, there was something in the book about that, I'll just go back. So each chapter has an introduction and then a summary, so that you can easily pick up the bit of the book that you wanted that information from. And it's got lots of useful websites and telephone numbers at the back. So I might introduce a subject, but if you want more information, you can follow that through.
Which is really useful, because when you're in that moment yourself where you're caring or trying to support another carer, such as a parent who's looking after somebody who's life limited, then you haven't got the time for that research. You haven't got the energy to put into research or looking for phone numbers or getting the right advice, have you? And that 10-minute slot with your local GP isn't going to give you everything you need.
And I think hopefully if you've got that information yourself, you can plan and make the most of those medical appointments. Because I think the more we can do for ourselves, then the more use we can make of those medical appointments, in the fact that we're asking for very specific things and we're not asking for questions that can be answered elsewhere.
I don't know if you've noticed, but in the last I suppose since my focus has been on end of life, in the last 5 years, that there seems to be more in the news and more on the telly and people discussing talking about dying and bringing that out into the open, do you think it's actually taking effect? Do you think we are more open with that debate?
I would hope so, particularly with the work I did with the End of Life Partnership, and the work still goes on in their public health team to raise the awareness and get people in general public talking about these issues. I would hope so. It's interesting that there have been surveys where people have been asked, how comfortable are you talking about end-of-life care, your own and other people's? And many people have answered, yes, I am. And the reluctance seems to be with raising the subject because they think other people are uncomfortable. So if we all took the step to raise this issue, we'd find that perhaps many more people are actually more comfortable about talking about this than we realise. And actually, it's better to raise it when we're not facing a life-limiting illness ourselves or with other people. So you and I can have a conversation. We've both had our health issues, but we've both had those conversations about what we individually would like. And it was difficult raising the subject with my husband, but we had approached the subject beforehand. So it was easier when we found out he had cancer.
Had he read your book?
He had, actually.
Before he was ill?
Yeah,
that's an interesting one.
Yeah, he'd read it from an editorial position. So he was looking for spelling mistakes and grammar.
Okay.
He didn't necessarily agree with everything I put in the book.
Do you think it helped him? He must have on some level absorbed some of that information. even from an editing perspective, he must have had a feeling for where you were going with it. And
I think so, yeah. I think it's interesting when you talk about your own experiences, like we looked after his mum as she died. His experience was different from my experience. So some of the things I'd written, he had it from a different perspective as his mum died. But the fact of talking about this sort of thing, making plans, preparing, knowing what your wishes are, passing those messages on, he's no difficulty with that. He's really clear about what he wants and he's listened and understood what I want. And we've been very clear with our daughter as well, so she knows what we want. So she's our backup power of attorney. So she's involved in that conversation.
Just brings it out into the open, doesn't it? I suppose it brings it out there and makes it possible to have a conversation.
Yeah.
Whether, that's the first step, isn't it?
It is.
Airing the subject so that, we could talk about dying. It's probably acceptable. We could do that. We could get our heads around that conversation, whether you actually start the process or not. That's actually the first step, isn't it?
It is, in raising the subject. And he's never had a difficulty with that. He's always been very clear about what his wishes are. So I'm not sure what he learned from reading the book. I think each person takes something different because it depends where they're at in life and what's meaningful for them. I suppose what I was trying to convey is that first chapter is moments of peace, and you're thinking, well, how on earth can caring for someone you love who's dying be peaceful? But what I've experienced in being present with somebody, you were talking about living in the moment, but actually being willing to be present with somebody as they come to the end of their life, you get so many lessons and so many moments that you just would never have if you didn't dare go there. So, moments where you can have intimate conversations, moments where you just do something very small, but you can tell it means all the world to your loved one. And however difficult it is, if you are managing to take care of yourself as well, those moments remain very precious in your memories. Whereas if you don't dare go there, you can miss out. And I'm not saying that as a judgment to anybody, because I know certainly when we were caring for my mother-in-law, it wasn't possible for everyone in her life to be there on a regular basis. Some people chose not to be there, and that was their choice. We chose to be there, and we were glad we did choose to be there because there were some very special moments. It wasn't always easy, and she was quite a formidable woman and had certain views and opinions about life and about what she wanted. But having said that, you always get some level of connection, reward, whatever you want to call it, by engaging, trusting, and going through the hardships. Because out of that, you get some really special memories, special moments. And I'm not saying that to belittle what you go through, because it is quite tough. certainly there were moments when I thought, can I do this? I'm really not sure I can do this. And my view in that process was to be able to look myself in the eye in a mirror and say I'd done what I could. And at the end I could. I was able to say that. We'd seen it through and we'd given her the best support we could at that moment in time. And I'm not saying it was perfect. It certainly was far from perfect. But we travelled with her, we stayed with her, and we decided that that was the best thing we could do for her.
Yeah, and I think the book is just a wonderful guide. And as you say, if everybody could be persuaded to read that book now, have those conversations now, rather than wait until we hit that crisis point, which is part of what I try to do with Surviving Me, is get people to focus on living their legacy right now, today. And living in this moment and bringing everything into this moment, including your death. So you're living for now, but facing everything.
I think there's quite a lot of Buddhist teaching about meditating on your death, because that means that your life has so much more purpose and meaning. So we know that this is a life that's finite. We know that we're not going to live forever, but that makes our moments here sweeter. If we were to live forever, then we could just waste our time and waste our life and it wouldn't matter. But because we do have limited time, knowing who we are and knowing what's most important to us puts things in perspective. So when I was writing my advanced decisions about refusing treatment, I also wrote my preferences in terms of how I live my life, so that if I'm no longer able to communicate, people know what's important to me. And it means you don't waste time on things that aren't important. So by writing that, I'm really, really clear that walking in the countryside, if I don't do that regularly, I'm no good to anybody. And me and you, we have lovely walks in the countryside and we catch up and we chat, and being with friends is also an important thing for me. So knowing what's important to each individual gives us that sense of purpose and meaning, rather than wasting time on things that we feel we should do or are important, but are really important to other people, not necessarily us.
And hopefully in some way, even if on only an emotional and mental level, because we don't know what each day holds for us and physically what will happen to us at the end, but it will prepare us emotionally and mentally for a better death.
And I think, having watched people as they come towards end of life and walked with them and being present, it's not easy, because a lot of the physical things that happen take away from what you can do in life. So, for example, I visited somebody who really lost the capacity to walk. So she was only able to access the outside life through a wheelchair and through somebody being with her constantly going out. That didn't deteriorate, that didn't take away from the enjoyment she got looking around a shop. So going shopping with her was always pleasant, because she just was like a child in a sweet shop. Every time you went shopping with her, she'd look at everything that was new. And there were certain things she loved to do. She loved to paint. She took up art towards the end of her life. And in fact, she was the one that produced the artwork for the front of the book. And I got permission after she'd died from her relatives to use that painting on the front of the book. But she was a real character. So spending time doing art at the hospice and going out shopping, and we even went to see a movie together, which turned out to be quite rude, and we didn't realise at the beginning. But sitting there looking at each other, watching this film, we were just laughing like children. And those sorts of moments, you're still being able to access things that are important to you, even if you're not able to do it on your own for yourself. If you've got somebody who can help you access them, even if it's in a slightly different mode, it still means you get an enjoyment out of life and living till the very last moment. And even when she was in the hospice, we were sat round chatting, me and her family. And I think she was semi-conscious at that point, but we were talking about children's programmes, what we used to watch when we were all children, and we were laughing. And I hope that she was conscious of that and was part of that, even if she couldn't contribute in terms of talking about it. But it was a very special time, certainly for me, and being part of her family by her bedside. And it's that sort of sense of enjoyment of life and making the most out of life, even if we're caring and even if we're the one that's coming towards end of life.
And taking the fear away from it all is so vital, isn't it? So anything that can give us information, like your book, gives people snippets of information which may or may not resonate at the time, but being prepared and as I say, removing anxiety out of a situation makes it so much better.
It does. I mean, just knowing that there are medications that can be given towards the end of life that help with various things. So, if someone's feeling sick, they can give an anti-nausea drug. If someone's feeling anxious, there's a drug that you can have that reduces that anxiety. If somebody can't breathe, then there are techniques you can use and a drug that can be given. So, and if you're in pain, there are different varieties of drugs that can be given to help with that pain. So knowing that, it's really important. And I did have a conversation with one of the people I was visiting. We were just driving at the time, and she asked me, will I be in pain at the end of life? And I said, if that's something that's important to you, talk to the people who are looking after you medically, and they will make a note and make sure that you are kept comfortable. So knowing what's important to you, I know one of the things that I fear is being breathless. But having seen that there are techniques that can help out with being breathless, and there are drugs that can be had at the end of life that will help with that breathlessness, it gives me confidence that if I ask the right questions at the right time, I will have access to those and I will be helped. Takes the fear away, as you say.
Yeah, it does. I had a client the other day and we actually walked around in care in the hospice because he wanted to see where he was going, he said. And I think the week after I wasn't in, but I think he was taking his wife round. It was viewing the accommodation, which I thought was wonderful, really, that he was preparing himself and without fear.
Yeah.
And being quite comfortable. He had made a decision not to receive any more treatment. And so he was, obviously had a good understanding of his prognosis and where he was heading. So he was able still to plan and embrace the moment.
Yeah. It's very special when you share those moments with people, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
There's a level of acceptance of what's going to happen, but then you very often find that those people live life to the fullest.
Absolutely.
To the end.
And in a very peaceful way.
Yeah.
It seems to be a real blessing the more that they can focus on living and not dying and get the dying bit in perspective and take the fear away, that their living is much better.
And we know what special people work in those environments, both in hospices, hospitals, care homes. And there are some angels that are there looking after us every day, and some of the care that's given is second to none, and you can just see people giving of their warmth and care and understanding and going the extra mile for people. It's not always like that, but a lot of people receive very, very good care at the end of their life.
Oh, thank you, Jill. Thank you for the conversation. I'm sure everybody's really enjoyed listening to you and your story, and hopefully this conversation might encourage people to go and buy your book in order to make themselves a little bit more comfortable and lose a little bit of fear about end of life. It's called Moments of Meaning and it's on Amazon. Okay, great interview with Jill. Really inspiring and pioneering work on a really difficult subject. End of life is one of those big topics we hate to discuss. It's too scary for most of us to go there into that great unknown, and we just don't talk about dying very well. Part of my working life exposes me 100% to this environment, and I appreciate that, but I appreciate also that others find it really a tough one to talk about. So, Kim, what about you? It's a big question. It's a tough topic.
I am one of those people. I don't really like talking about it. I have to say, for me personally, I'm not afraid of dying. I'm not afraid of dying because, I know it's going to happen. I'm not afraid of me dying. I'm afraid of me leaving people behind. I'm afraid of other people dying. And it's not something that it isn't easy to talk about And, you know, I've said to you before, for me, I didn't really it didn't even enter my life. I was very lucky. You know, my grandparents died when I was relatively young. So my parents, you know, my mum lost her mum early, really. And I'm really lucky. You know, my parents are still rocking and rolling. And I hadn't really come into the contact with that until I was about, I think I was about 41. So about, nearly 5 years ago now, where a really good friend of mine passed away very suddenly and hit, you know, my age. And all of a sudden I was like, whoa, you know, how the confusion, I was just left feeling so confused as to how I don't understand what's just happened. I don't understand how that just has happened. And that sudden feeling of we are not in control here. You know, you think, you know, I was quite lucky. I'd got to the age of 41 thinking that, you know, life was what you make it. And, you know.
And it goes on forever. Yeah, we're immortal.
You're immortal and, you know, you make your own luck and da-da-da. And then all of a sudden comes this huge lesson of, no, you're not in control. You're privileged to be here. And, you know, we are all in a line to some extent. And who knows when that's going to happen. So it was a real wake-up call for me, and has a massive impact on me and how I live my life. And, you know, the other thing was it led to me and my best friend sitting down and writing our wills. You know, we sat down and we said, right, let's do our wills. And funnily enough, they're still written, but actually they're still not signed and sealed because there's a conversation that I needed to have regarding, you know, what would happen to my children and blah, that I just couldn't bring myself to have with the people. And, you know, it was.
Do you feel more able to have that conversation now? Are you in a different place, or have you shelved it?
It's honestly, my daughter's now 20, my son's 16, and so I'm actually find that I'm having, you know, my thing is so actually the difficult conversation of who will look after my children, you know, that was to sit and be writing my will and to think who will look after my children is really just awful thing to have to think about. Now, one of the things that and even listening to the interview has made me think again, the one thing, and doing this podcast, the one thing for me is, if I'm not here, is that I need my children to know that they can be anything. And actually, that's a really important message for me to make sure they know. So I think that what I'm going to do is sit down and I'm going to write them both a letter. And when that letter gets opened, who knows? Hopefully I'll be, you know, the grand old age of 80, 90 years old, because that's what, you know, we all think is going to happen. Maybe it will be sooner than that, you know, maybe, who knows? But I think for me, that's how I could have that conversation. With regards to, you know, the other side of it is my dad had a heart attack last year, and that brought that into reality for me, you know, is that their mortality, and that's the conversation that we need to have in our family. And
it's interesting because what I've just heard you say is that sorting all this stuff out and leaving these messages behind for your kids, and, you know, is part of you living your legacy. And, you know, we put it off. It is a big topic, and we do put these things off. We do put off these difficult conversations, and we leave them till tomorrow. And then, you know, a crisis hits us and it all becomes very relevant and in our face. And we wish we'd done it sooner, because I think we do carry on living with that shadow and that hanging over us.
And it's, you know, for me, like I said, when we did the will, I said to my friend, I just need to have, I had already done, we did a will many years ago because we lived in Spain and we have property in Spain. So I did a will for that, and that I didn't really like doing that. And then this time was like, and it was something that I'd put off because of those conversations. And now, you know, I think, well, actually, what it means is security. To have those conversations now with my loved ones, with my parents and with my partner, and, you know, it will actually make me feel more secure. It will make me feel that, you know, I have crossed the T's and dotted the I's. And I actually think that counts for a lot.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what Jill was trying to say in that interview, that when people who are forced into that position of having to do it
Yeah.
at end of life have done it,
Yeah.
it leaves them remarkably peaceful. And everything's, you've drawn that line under situations, you've resolved issues, you've perhaps had those conversations that you don't want to have, that are really difficult whilst you're still focused on living. But it brings a sense of peace.
Yeah, and allows dignity for the people that you love. Like you say, I don't want to think of my parents' immortality. We lost my father-in-law a couple of years ago. And again, that was very sudden, very, it came out of the blue. And it's things that you don't want to think about, but actually it's good to know what people want so that they can leave their legacy and that dignity as well.
Absolutely. So the big takeaway from that is get on with it and
have the conversations.
Start having
make the arrangements, write the will, because no one's going to get away with it. We're not going to get away with that one. It's going to happen at some point, and actually, we do owe it not just to ourselves but to our loved ones to sit in that little bit of discomfort, have that conversation, and actually then you can go off and you can enjoy life feeling a bit more secure. So it has really prompted me. I've got to thank you both, because it has sort of prompted me to have those conversations and to write those 2 letters that I really, really would like left behind. So thank you.
Good. So that's all for now. Go away, enjoy the rest of your day, and have a good think about it. We hope you enjoyed the Living Your Legacy podcast. If you did, subscribe and come back for the next one. If you didn't, well, there's no accounting for taste.